USPAP page 152. Advisory opinion 30 continued. 3. The competency rule requires appraisers to provide competent service, including the specific requirement to recognize and comply with applicable laws and regulations. Number 4. In developing assignment results, the scope of work rule requires appraisers to determine, perform, and disclose the scope of work necessary to produce credible assignment results. Determining the appropriate scope of work requires identification of the problem to be solved, which includes identification of assignment conditions. The scope of work is acceptable when it meets or exceeds the expectations of parties who are regularly intended users for similar assignments. Upon accepting an assignment, an appraiser is obligated to competently satisfy the applicable assignment conditions. Number 5. Standards Rule 1-1A is an extension of the competency rule that specifically requires that the appraiser be aware of, understand, and correctly employ those recognized methods and techniques that are necessary to produce a credible appraisal. Number 6. Standards Rules 2-1A and 2-1B require that each written appraisal report, A, clearly and accurately set forth the appraisal in a manner that will not be misleading, and B, contain sufficient information to enable intended users of the appraisal to understand the report properly. Number 7, Standard 2 also requires that report content be consistent with the intended use of the appraisal. Use of the jurisdictional exemption rule is not appropriate because none of the requirements in the agency's appraisal laws and regulations preclude compliance with USPAP. Appraisers must identify and consider the intended use and intended users in an assignment to understand their USPAP development and reporting obligations. The agency's appraisal regulations and guidelines contain assignment conditions that are part of competent performance when they apply in an assignment. Therefore, compliance with USPAP requirements for proper development and reporting require adherence to those assignment conditions that apply in an assignment. Failure to adhere to assignment conditions. Failure to recognize and adhere to applicable assignment conditions violates one or more of the USPAP requirements previously identified. An appraiser who represents that an assignment is or will be completed in compliance with applicable assignment conditions and who then knowingly fails to comply with those assignment conditions violates the ethics rule. An appraiser who unintentionally fails to comply with or fails to recognize those assignment conditions violates the competency rule. An appraiser who fails to develop assignment results in accordance with the assignment conditions necessary for credible assignment results violates the scope of work rule and Standard 1. An appraiser who fails to report assignment results in accordance with the assignment conditions that are necessary to enable intended users to understand the report properly violates Standard 2. Obligations for appraisers performing appraisals by a federally regulated financial institution. Note: all quotations in this section are from the agency's appraisal regulations. The quoted text is only a portion of the complete regulations, and the applicable regulations should be reviewed in their entirety. Appraisal independence. The agency's appraisal regulations state, in part, if an appraisal is prepared by a staff appraiser, that appraiser must be independent of the lending, investment, and collection functions and not involved, except as an appraiser, in the federally related transaction, and have no direct or indirect interest, financial or otherwise, in the property. If the only qualified persons available to perform an appraisal are involved in the lending, investment, or collection functions of the regulated institution shall take appropriate steps to ensure that the appraisers exercise independent judgment. Such steps include, but are not limited to, prohibiting an individual from performing an appraisal in connection with federally related transactions in which the appraiser is otherwise page 153, involved, and prohibiting directors and officers from participating in any vote or approval involving assets on which they performed an appraisal. If an appraisal is prepared by a fee appraiser, the appraiser shall be engaged directly by the regulated institution or its agent, and have no direct or indirect interest, financial or otherwise, in the property or the transaction. A regulated institution also may accept an appraisal that was prepared by an appraiser engaged directly by another financial services institution if, number one, the appraiser has no direct or indirect interest, financial or otherwise, in the property or the transaction, and two, the regulated institution determines that the appraisal conforms to the requirements of this subpart and is otherwise acceptable. For more information on these requirements and related USPAP obligations, see Advisory Opinion 25, Clarification of the Client in a Federally Related Transaction, and Advisory Opinion 26, Readdressing, which means transferring a report to another party. Appraisal development and reporting. The agency's appraisal regulations state, in part, for federally related transactions, all appraisals shall, at a minimum, A, conform to generally accepted appraisal standards as evidenced by the Uniform Standards of Professional Appraisal Practice, USPAP, promulgated by the Appraisal Standards Board of the Appraisal Foundation, 1155 15th Street, Suite 1111, Northwest Washington, D.C., 20005, unless principles of safe and sound banking require compliance with stricter standards. B. Be written and contain sufficient information and analysis to support the institution's decision to engage in the transaction. C. Analyze and report appropriate deductions and discounts for proposed construction or renovation, partially leased buildings, non-market lease terms, and tract developments with unsold units. D. Be based upon the definition of market value as set forth in this subpart. And E. Be performed by state licensed or certified appraisers in accordance with requirements set forth in this subpart. Market value definition. The agency's appraisal regulations state, in part, market value means the most probable price which a property should bring in a competitive and open market under all conditions requisite to a fair sale, the buyer and seller each acting prudently and knowledgeably, and assuming the price is not affected by undue stimulus. Implicit in this definition are the consummation of a sale as of a specified date and the passing of title from seller to buyer under conditions whereby. Number 1, both the buyer and seller are typically motivated. Number 2, both parties are well informed or well advised and acting in what they consider their own best interests. Number 3, a reasonable time is allowed for exposure in the open market. Number 4, payment is made in terms of cash in US dollars or in terms of financial arrangements comparable thereto. And number 5, the price represents the normal consideration for the property sold, unaffected by special or creative financing or sales concessions granted by anyone associated with the sale. Commonly asked questions. Number 1, how do the assignment conditions that apply to appraisals for use by a federally regulated financial institution affect the appraiser's scope of work and report content?